Thanks Susie, thanks Stephen, appreciate the kind words. Okay, so my talk this evening is about a topic that quite often is just seen as a footnote in the Titanic story. So, you know, if you do a Google search, or perhaps it's on the Wikipedia page, you will typically read a summary that in April 1912, shortly after the Titanic disaster, Olympics crew went on strike, and that they were on strike because of the lack of lifeboats, or they had concerns about the lifeboats. That's not the whole story. There's actually quite a lot of complexity to this. So I'm going to be giving you a bit of a summary of what happened in April 1912 and putting the broader context in place. And I think the intention is to have a short question and answer afterwards. So happy to take further questions then as well. Okay, so two of the people who are quite significant to this story are J. Bruce Ismay, who was the chairman and managing director of the White Star Line, which owned Olympic and Titanic. He, of course, survived the Titanic disaster. And then we have Captain Edward John, or E.J. Smith, who did not survive the Titanic disaster. He, of course, was Titanic's captain for her final voyage. And you notice from the dates there, he was 62 when he passed away in the disaster. You will see in some sources that he gave his age as 59. So for some reason, early in 1912, he seems to have wanted to drop a couple of years from his age. And Smith is pictured there on Olympic in 1911. So this is a favourite image of mine, a picture of Olympic. It's a postcard that was issued, and this quote is from the inscription on the back. Someone has just written, "Isn't this a beautiful boat?" It should be a ship, but that's we know what they're referring to. And Olympic, of course, made her maiden voyage in June 1911. This is her on the right, arriving in New York. You've got the tugs there, which gives some idea of the scale of the ship and how large she was. And then the Cunard liner Lusitania was leaving New York that day, and you can see her in the distance. And there was a popular anecdote that when Lusitania was leaving New York, there was no signal to recognise Olympic. So there was some speculation in the press that because they were rival ships, they just omitted that courtesy. But I suspect personally it was just a small oversight. So Olympic made a number of voyages in 1911 and 1912. She had her share of accidents. There was a large collision with HMS Hawke in September 1911. That took her out of service for some weeks. But on the whole, it was a successful time. She carried a good number of passengers. She proved popular. And of course, by April 1912, things are looking up even further, because the White Star Line have looked forward to their new Titanic entering service. So they're expecting that they will have her join Olympic and help to take the cream of the North Atlantic passenger trade. And this is Olympic arriving in New York, 10th of April 1912. This, of course, is the same day that Titanic left Southampton on her maiden voyage. And you can just see there the decks lined with passengers, and they've arrived quite safely at the dock. There was some comment in the press that this was going to be Olympic's last trip to New York as the biggest ship afloat, because her sister ship Titanic was slightly larger in terms of the gross registered tonnage. So confusingly, this is not weight, this is a measure of size, and because she had a higher gross tonnage, Titanic was classed as a larger ship than her older sister. And I always enjoy the kind of social commentary, that element to things, because if we look at the bottom of that article there is an aristocrat who said that he was leaving England to start a new life in Canada, and the complaint was that the taxes were too high, so they were going abroad. So some things never seem to change. Right, so there was a pretty quick turnaround, because Olympic left New York on the 13th of April 1912, which was a Saturday. Quite a good number of passengers, and yes, there was a good crowd at the pier to see her off. And by this time, of course, Titanic is well underway on her own maiden voyage, heading out into the Atlantic. So we can see here on the left Captain Herbert James Haddock. So he's got quite a nautical name. He was well regarded, and we have some quotes there from the ship's chief surgeon, Dr. John Beaumont, described him as a great navigator and sailor, a gentleman, possibly moody at times by the sound of it, and also that he never raised his voice, which is interesting because I've heard the same said about Captain E.J. Smith. And I guess if you're captain material, you've kind of got that natural air of authority, so you don't have to raise your voice or shout at people to earn that respect. And as you can see, he was born in Rugby, which is probably as far away from the sea as you can get in England. He had been with the White Star Line since the late 1880s, and he'd had his first command since 1893. Had an extra master's certificate, which is pretty hard to get, and also commander in the Royal Naval Reserve. So he was captain of Cedric, which was White Star's largest ship in 1903 when she entered service. Then Oceanic, which was 8 years old by 1907, but still a very prestigious ship. And he was Olympics captain from 1912 to 14. He eventually left the White Star Line and saw a period of service in the Royal Navy, as he was in the Royal Naval Reserve. And there is a special note there on his record that he was warmly commended by the naval authorities. So he was someone that was, again, very highly regarded. So this is a photo from 11th of April 1912, and this is when Titanic was off Queenstown, now Cove, and that's just a very good photograph of the boat deck, just to give some idea of the layout of the deck and the context. It's a very spacious deck, and you can just see some of the lifeboats on the left, and there's plenty of space for passengers to walk. And again, just to give a bit of the broader context, these plans are of Olympic's boat deck, but the layout on Olympic and Titanic was very much the same. And you can just see that the boats are grouped forward and aft, and then there's a very large span of open promenade space amidships. So Olympic was barely a day into her eastbound crossing from New York when her senior wireless operator, Ernest Moore, picked up a message from MGY. And MGY was Titanic's code, her call sign, and he made an entry to update the wireless log. So here's Titanic signalling to some ship, something about striking an iceberg. Wasn't quite clear who has struck an iceberg. Is it Titanic or not? Dr. Beaumont was on board, and he described the voyage by saying, all went smoothly until Sunday night, the 14th of April. Around midnight, the purser Claude Lancaster and I were in his room smoking a pipe together when the door opened and in walked Bob Fleming, the chief engineer. Boys, he said, there is awful trouble. The Titanic has been struck by an iceberg, is badly damaged, and we are going up north to her assistance. Interesting phrasing. The Titanic has been struck by the iceberg, so it's the iceberg's fault, basically. And all of Olympic's crew did their utmost to get the ship ready. They lit up all of the boilers and they drove the ship as fast as possible to try and get to Titanic's aid. And she certainly attained a very high rate of speed. We know that before the war, Olympic had attained a speed of more than 24 knots. And this was a ship that was designed for 21 knots. So it's possible that this was the occasion when they attained that speed, because they're making all this effort to get all that coal into the boilers, to drive the ship as fast as possible and try to come to the rescue. And unfortunately, of course, there was no time, and Titanic sank long before Olympic could get there, because Olympic, of course, was still 500 miles away. One of the greasers on board passed away during the voyage. It wasn't uncommon, unfortunately, that there would be deaths on board, either crew or passengers. Some idea of the stress on board the ship and just how people reacted to it was that they forgot to do the paperwork. So you're meant to put an official notification in of a death. That was overlooked, and Dr. Beaumont, as the ship's chief surgeon, had to notify the authorities, and he ended up doing it a month late. And he just apologised and said it was because of the stress of work. So Olympic got back to Southampton. She was scheduled to leave on the 24th of April 1912 to go back from Southampton to New York. Now, this was a quick turnaround at the best of times, but J. Bruce Ismay had issued an instruction that no White Star liner was going to leave port without enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Now, Olympic, in common with Titanic and virtually all the liners of the period, did not have enough lifeboats for all of the passengers and crew. So very quickly they undertook a frantic search to try and source as many lifeboats as possible. And these are just some photos showing some of the types of boats. So this is a Berthon collapsible boat. So you can see there, essentially it's completely folded open, and you can see on the right that cylinder is a water cask, and there are then bottom boards and struts which flatten out when the boat is open. So you know, to use the boat, they have to fully extend it and get it working. So it does the job, but it's not quite as good as a standard lifeboat. And just another view to give a bit of the context. This is the forward end of Olympic's boat deck, and you can just see there some of the original lifeboats, and then they're installing various other boats on deck because they're adding these extra boats to make sure that there are enough on board. Oh, sorry. So recognise again the Titanic photo on the left. This is basically a before and after comparison, so you can see the same area on Olympic in May 1912, and you can just see with those extra collapsible boats that they've added on, essentially it's taking up all of that space on the deck, so the deck is a lot more enclosed now. That space has gone because they're using it to store the lifeboats. And here's just another view. This is when Olympic reached New York. One of the lifeboats, I think that's boat 10 on the port side, is being prepared, and you can see the various crew around, and another one of the collapsible boats that had been added, just for context. And it gives an idea as well just of how high the boat deck is compared to the waterline. I think it was about 65 feet, if I remember rightly. So the man who was employed as the assistant emigration officer at Southampton was Captain Maurice Harvey Clark. He was the same man who had cleared Titanic for sailing a fortnight earlier, and he was a captain in his own right. He had an extra master's certificate as well. He'd been at sea for 22 years, so he's not just a surveyor. He's a very experienced man, and he described his duties. So he goes on board the ship early on the morning before sailing, and he's there more than 4 hours doing various things. So he has to inspect the third-class passenger accommodation, make sure it complies with the regulations and that everything is safe for the passengers. He sees that the crew are mustered, and does all manner of checks that are needed just to then give the ship her clearance to leave port. Now, early on Sunday, the 21st of April 1912, he learned that a large number of new boats were being placed on board Olympic. So he decided of his own volition that he would go and visit Olympic, just to make sure that he was happy with the new boats that were being put on board, and making sure that everything looked okay on the boat deck. The number of boats that were being added was more than what were needed. So the White Star Line had essentially gone overboard. They'd got as many collapsible boats as they could get, and orders came down from the head office of the White Star Line at Liverpool that they only needed an extra 24 boats, because if they added another 24 collapsible boats, that would be more than enough boats for the number of passengers and crew on the ship. So they decided that they would remove some of these extra boats from the ship just because they're not needed. Unfortunately, the rumour mill started in Southampton because it became known that they were taking lifeboats off the ship. And there was this view, why would they do that? There must be something wrong with the lifeboats. And a rumour started that the Board of Trade, and particularly Captain Clark, must have condemned the boats and said, they're not up to standard. That wasn't the case. But once rumours get started, it can be hard to get to the truth. This is a bit of an aside to the mutiny, but this is a headline from a UK tabloid 13 years ago now, and I mention it because they're personal papers of Captain Clark that went up for auction, and it was completely sensationalised in media reports. So it was essentially implying that Clark said there weren't enough lifeboats on Titanic, and essentially that his warnings were overwritten, that he was told he would lose his job and so on. none of that is true. Titanic fully complied with the lifeboat regulations, in fact had more than the regulations required. Now, whether the regulations were adequate or not is another matter, but she did comply with the law. And if we look at the notes, which were reproduced in the paper, there's a very important pointer there. You can just see right in the top left, he's written Titanic had. So he's talking in the past tense. These are not notes that were before the Titanic disaster. These were notes that were written afterwards. And what seems to have happened is that the Board of Trade asked their experts, you know, what would you suggest in the future? And what Clark seems to have done is suggest that there should be about 50% more lifeboats. So to put that in context, that might be going from 20 lifeboats up to 30. And we can then see that there are various other notes that Clark had made, and they related to all manner of things, including davits, which are used to lower the boats, the number of deck crew on board, the number of firemen. And what he does say is that he would be left without support if he deviated from the regulations. So it's his job to clear the ship to go to sea. He has to enforce the regulations, but he can't go anything beyond that. But to this day, because of these headlines, there are quite a few people who are under the impression that Clark was pressured to clear Titanic to go to sea, or that he feared he would lose his job. That's simply not the case. So we can see him here on Olympic, and this is part of his inspection on the morning before sailing. He's in one of the original boats there, and you can just see on the boat deck beside the officers' quarters there's a load of the additional collapsible boats which have been fitted on board. To put a bit of context to it, I think the term floating city is quite apt. Olympic's crew was enormous, and we can see here on the left Mauritania, which was the largest liner in the world from 1907 until 1911, had less than 800 crew. Compared to Olympic on her maiden voyage, she had nearly 900 crew, and then on the voyage that the mutiny occurred, well, the cancelled voyage in April 1912, she had 914 crew who were signed on. And you can just see the split there. You've got 70 in the sailing or the deck department. So that includes the captain, the ship's officers, the firemen, the people who basically, and the lookouts as well, the quartermasters, basically the people who sail the ship. And then, although she was not designed for speed compared to Mauritania, she actually needed about the same number of people in the engine department. And on this particular voyage, they took on slightly more people. And then the victualling department essentially is the hotel staff. So these are the stewards, the stewardesses who have to look after all of the passengers. And it required nearly 500 people on Olympic. Now that's more than any other ship of the period. And in large part, that's because so many first and second class passengers were carried. So they require better service than the third class passengers. So you have a higher ratio of stewards compared to the number of first and second class passengers. So Captain Clark inspected Olympic that morning. So this was Wednesday, the 24th of April, 1912. He reported that the lifeboat crews went through the exercise under his instruction. He said he was quite satisfied with both the officers and the deck crew. There were other crew standing by, so they observed the drill, and they had therefore a better idea of how the extra boats would be handled if there was an emergency. And he went into some detail explaining to the crew the finer points of how the collapsible boats needed to be worked, needed to be operated. So essentially, if there was an emergency, the ship's crew would be more familiar with the collapsible boats. They'd be able to operate them, be able to lower them safely as part of an evacuation of the ship. And about 10 minutes before noon, he was about to give the ship her sailing clearance when some of the ship's firemen walked off the ship and went to the dock. And there were various efforts made both by Captain Clark, by officers of the White Star Line, to convince the firemen, look, the ship is safe to sail, the boats have been inspected, they're passed, Captain Clark is happy to clear the ship to go to sea, but it's fair to say that the firemen who had walked off the ship were not convinced. So Olympic was moved to she left the dock and she was moved to an anchorage off the Isle of Wight, essentially while they could work out how to resolve the situation. So the following morning, 4 of the collapsible boats were opened out, 2 were lowered into the water. It took 2 hours, and at that point they decided to abandon the work because they didn't want to alarm the passengers. The passengers were starting to come on deck. And we've just got some pictures here which give an idea of what was being done. So you can see here at the top left, they're preparing one of the collapsible boats for lowering. You can then see the boats being lowered all the way, that huge steel side of the ship, and then the boat being rowed around. So as part of this drill, it did take a bit longer than previously, but everything went fine. The boats were fine, and Captain Clark was happy with the boats. And that morning, Thomas Lewis came on board Olympic. He was the president of the Seafarers Union. Now, the Seafarers Union had only been established in October 1911, so you're only talking 5 or 6 months earlier. And there was a conference between Thomas Lewis, Captain Haddock, and the ship's officers. They lowered 6 boats, which had been randomly chosen by Thomas Lewis, into the water. One of the boats had a very slight leak. There was a tiny hole was discovered in the side of the boat, which led to a slight leak. So the boat was in the water for about 2 hours, and they just had a noticeable quantity of water, but he thought it could be bailed out pretty easily. So in the case of that particular boat, there was a concern that there was a hole in it, and that particular boat was faulty. He said he thought that the damage looked like it had been caused by some sort of nail or something. But essentially the outcome of this was that Thomas Lewis agreed to recommend to the firemen that it was safe to come back on board the ship and to sail Olympic to New York, provided that this one boat was replaced. Now, it was that evening, so they were already well behind schedule, that a number of replacement firemen came on board. This report is from Captain Clark. So he describes that he came aboard the ship. They examined 100 of these firemen. The chief engineer was happy with them. The doctor was happy with them. So it was looking as if they had replacement crew and that the voyage would be able to proceed. Unfortunately, having recruited a number of firemen to replace the firemen who had left the ship, they then had a group of seamen leave the ship. So these are crew from the deck department. And of course the deck department is much smaller than the number of firemen, but nonetheless you need all of the crew to operate the ship. And it was by now getting to Friday, 26th of April 1912, and Captain Haddock sent a signal to Captain Goodenough, I'm not sure I'm saying that quite correctly, who was the commander of HMS Cochrane, and he asked if the Royal Navy could give assistance to Olympic. So he joined Olympic. The seamen who had left the ship were in a tender at the side of the ship because, of course, she's anchored, she's not at the dock. And they explained to the naval commander that they were refusing to serve on the ship unless the replacement firemen were replaced. They had some concern still about the lifeboats, but it seemed that the main issue was the quality of the firemen. So this is an extract from a report that Captain Goodenough wrote, and he describes in detail the conversations that they had on board Olympic. So he said he didn't have any authority to arrest anyone. There's no threat of violence, no damage being done. The master, so that's Captain Haddock, was unwilling to ask them to use any force. And what he said was that the seamen were anxious to return to work, but he thought that they were more afraid of offending their union by working with the non-union men than of offending the law by breaking the law. So there was quite a bit of comment. So Goodenough was talking to some of the seamen who had left the ship. They said the new firemen were the riffraff of Portsmouth. Some of them were discharged second-class stokers. They were the kind of men that were hanging around pubs in the morning and basically were not suitable to be working on Olympic. And he told them that they did not have the right to leave the ship, which was anchored, was full of passengers, and it was the middle of the night. So once again, they had to try and get some more replacement crew. Now the seamen who had left the ship in the early hours of that Friday morning were taken ashore under the observation of Olympic's fifth officer, John Withers. An hour later, approximately, some replacement seamen came on board and they passed the examination as being fit to serve. There were one or two exceptions, but on the whole, Captain Clark was happy with them and the ship's captain was happy with them, Captain Haddock. And a little later, Clark was advised by the Board of Trade, under these circumstances, he can issue clearance for Olympic to leave for Cherbourg and Queenstown. So She was due to leave from Southampton originally. She had about 900 passengers on board who were still on the ship. The plan was to take on more passengers as normal at Cherbourg and then at Queenstown, now Cove, and then she would be cleared to go to New York. And again, just to give a bit of an idea, again, you can just see the scale of Olympic, towering above the Albert Edward, and then you can see here a number of the ship's crew that had deserted were being brought ashore. But by this time, of course, they were so far behind schedule that a message came down from the White Star Line's head office at Liverpool, and this was posted in the ship's companionway. I said it's with the greatest regret they announced that they were compelled to abandon the voyage, notwithstanding every effort they'd made to obtain a crew. So they'd lost some of the firemen, they'd replaced the firemen, they'd lost some of the seamen, they replaced the seamen, but now they were so far behind schedule that it simply wasn't worth continuing with the voyage. They had recruited some additional crew just to make sure they could try and drive the ship as fast as possible, but she was so far behind schedule it just wasn't going to work. So Olympic returned to Southampton late that Friday evening. And needless to say, this hit the headlines. I always like to pick some of the more obscure newspapers, but you can see similar headlines in the Southampton Times, the Times of London, the major papers of the day. And again, you can just see at the time they focused on the non-union men, and that it had led to complications, which was a bit of an understatement. Some of the passengers were complaining. There was an American passenger who spoke to the Daily Mirror, and he said he needed to be in the States by Sunday in a week's time, because if he wasn't there, he was going to lose £10,000. You wouldn't want to lose £10,000 today. I dread to think how much that was worth in 1912. The ship's passengers, who had just been on board for 2 days while all of this was going on, said that the White Star Line had treated them well. It had been like a 2-day pleasure cruise, and they placidly accepted the situation. There was one passenger who'd just been pacing about in a state of furious indignation. Other passengers just made the best of it. There was one passenger that was just in the gymnasium working out. And it was also noted that, I think partly this was a factor in the voyage being cancelled completely, but it was noted that the ship's stores were being depleted because, of course, she stocked up with food, drinks, wine for 6 or 7 days, and 2 days of those have already been used up, and they were using them at a faster rate than on average. So as presumably passengers aboard, they're making the most of it, and just eating and drinking. Now this was a quote of an expert acquaintance, which I guess is the usual well-informed anonymous source, speaking to the Southampton Times, and it's quite interesting because as I highlight there, he was saying, well, there's been a great lack of confidence for some time in the Board of Trade. There have been grievances against the Board of Trade. They've not been listened to. Now, in the aftermath of the Titanic disaster, perhaps members of the crew have recognised that this is a chance to shout, to kick up a fuss. And this unnamed expert said that they wouldn't blame them. So this is Portsmouth Magistrates Court on that Friday afternoon. So there were 35 seamen, 5 quartermasters, 5 lookouts, 2 lamp trimmers, 4 greasers, an engine room storekeeper, and another. It was illegible, so I can't answer who that was. But these were the crew who had left Olympic, and they were charged under the Merchant Shipping Act of 1894 that if any seaman is guilty of wilful disobedience to lawful command, he should be liable to be imprisoned for a period not exceeding 4 weeks. All of them pleaded not guilty. So the White Star Line had a Mr. Hiscock who was prosecuting their case. There was a Dr. Emmanuel who was from the Seafarers Union to represent the men, and also a Mr. King who was appearing for some of the others. And the court transcripts are quite entertaining in places. The original documents don't seem to have survived, but there are some verbatim extracts in some of the newspapers of the day, which give a bit of an idea of the atmosphere in court. So Fifth Officer Withers was testifying. He was frequently saying, "I don't know, I can't say." And then at one point they were trying to pin him down as to the number of firemen who had initially left the ship. Said, well, were there not 284 of them? He didn't know, just says, well, you can't judge numbers. King was quite adversarial, he scolded him, don't say I can't judge numbers, I'm asking you. And then, someone else steps in, Hiscock, and says, when he says you, he means I cannot or anyone else cannot judge the numbers down to 1 or 2. So just so often they're asking for specific details, and either he doesn't know or he's just not keen to give the detail. Captain Haddock was also in court. He was asked, well, he was told that he was a very popular captain. He responded, I'm very pleased to hear it. Oh, sorry, I've lost that slide. And it was also suggested to Captain Haddock that he hadn't ordered the men to return to the ship. He just said, you advise them to return. And Haddock said, certainly not, I use the word order. And again, there was some discussion about him just saying it in a very casual fashion. And this is Charles McKean, one of the ship's engineers. He was testifying that they were happy with the substitute fireman. He was asked, is this skilled labour? And he responds, no, but it's hard work. There's quite a lot of laughter in court. But essentially the effect from his testimony was to confirm that from an engineer's point of view, he was quite happy with the replacement fireman who had been taken on board. Now, the verdict in this case was quite unusual. So they were all found guilty, but the magistrates essentially used their better judgment, and they said it would not be expedient to send them to prison or to impose a fine. So they were found guilty of willful disobedience, but in the exceptional circumstances they didn't think that a punishment was required, and they weren't sent to prison. So quite an unusual judgment that they're guilty, but we're not going to enforce a punishment. And they were taking into account the extraordinary events of the Titanic disaster, and what was really an unprecedented situation. This was a topic of questions to the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. This was Liberal Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, and the concern that this MP, George Terrell, had raised was that because Olympic was delayed, well, ultimately the voyage was cancelled, of course, but the result of that was that the royal mails that were being carried were going to be late going to New York, so they had to send them by another ship. So they were saying, what action is going to be taken against the British Seafarers Union? And then the Prime Minister responded that there were no grounds for action, or no adequate grounds for action on the part of the government. This was quite widely discussed. This is a letter to Sidney Buxton at the Board of Trade, which was from the honorary political secretary of the Hammersmith Club, and they had passed a resolution congratulating the seamen from the Olympic, and that they had taken a stand, and they too were saying, we want to protest against any punishment being meted out to them, because in light of recent events, the men had only done what was natural in the interests of the travelling public and themselves. Now, the White Star Line, of course, had to make further arrangements. So there were 900 passengers who had been on Olympic at the time. She had been due to take on another 400 or 500 at Cherbourg and Queenstown. So there was approximately 1,400 passengers who were delayed in getting to New York, and they had to find alternative ships for them to sail on. And they also had to arrange for the ship's mails to be diverted, and they went on Cunard's Lusitania to New York. But the White Star Line were also worried because they had incurred some costs in attempting to sail the ship. So they wrote a letter to the Southampton Harbour Board, the relevant port authority, and asked, under the special circumstances, are you still going to charge us £87 and 7 shillings, which was the cost that White Star would have owed to the Southampton Harbour Board for Olympic to be sailing from Southampton. Because they said, well, the voyage didn't happen because it was abandoned under the special circumstances. Now, the Finance Committee of the Southampton Harbour Board met on the 13th of May 1912, and as usual with committees, they talked about it for ages and took a vote, and they came to a classic bureaucratic compromise, and they said that they would only charge the White Star Line half. So the White Star Line would have got a bit more than £40 back refunded from the cost that they'd incurred paying the Southampton Harbour Board. And they were undoubtedly pleased about that, but this was a period where the Titanic disaster was still fresh in the travelling public's mind, and for the White Star Line, what they wanted to do was get back to normal circumstances. But in April 1912, it was probably the most extraordinary month for any shipping line. I can't think of a comparable example. And in the case of Olympic, she sailed to New York in May 1912, and over time settled back into that regular service between Southampton and New York. She went on to have a career, lasted about 24 years. She carried hundreds of thousands of passengers, and she proved herself very much a successful ship. So undoubtedly, without an iceberg, her history would essentially have been Titanic's. That was all in the future in April 1912, and of course the White Star Line were probably just praying that they weren't going to have any more special circumstances. So happy to take any questions, and thanks for listening.